Welcome to the WCF Developer Screencast series. My name is Aaron Sconard and I work for Pluralsight, a training company that provides both instructor-led and online courses for Microsoft developers. Visit pluralsight.com for more details. In this short screencast, I'm going to show you how to configure a WCF service with a variety of different endpoints. In WCF, endpoints allow you to define how clients will be able to communicate with your service. And WCF provides numerous built-in communication options out of the box. Okay, let's dive in. Here we are in Visual Studio 2008, and we're going to be working with this eval service library project that we built in one of the previous screencasts. And what we're going to do now is configure this service with a variety of different communication endpoints. In WCF, you expose endpoints on services to configure how you communicate with that service, how the different clients out there in the world will be able to talk to that service over the wire. Now, let's see how this service is currently configured. If we go into our app.config file, we can see the WCF configuration section here, and we can see that our service, eval service, has been configured with two endpoints, these two guys right here. Each endpoint contains an address, a binding, and a contract. Those are the ABCs of WCF. Okay, the address specifies where we're going to talk to that service, the actual network address. The binding specifies how we're going to communicate with that service, like what transport protocol are we going to use and what other additional WS star protocols we might want to include in the message exchange. And finally, the contract tells us what the messages must contain. So here, in this particular example, we're using an empty address, which simply means use the base address for this particular protocol. We're using the WS-HTTP binding, which gives us some more advanced web services support around security, RM, and transactions. And then we're using for the contract eval service. So this is the one that allows us to actually communicate with our eval service through the contract we defined. Okay, then the second endpoint down here, notice the address uses a relative address of MEX, so that would be the base address plus MEX on the end. It uses the MEX HTTP binding, which just does basic HTTP. And then the contract is metadata exchange, which is a well-known contract for exchanging metadata at runtime. Okay, so these are the two endpoints that are exposed on our service. One and both of them use different communication styles and different contracts, and allow us to do different things with our service. Now you'll also notice down here that we've configured our host with a base HTTP address of localhost port 8731 / design time addresses / eval service library / service 1 /. And that's the base address that will be used for both of these different endpoints. So for this first endpoint, we're just going to be using this address right here that you see down below. And then for this second endpoint, it'll be this address plus MEX on the end. So if I go ahead and press F5 to run this thing, this client is going to use the MEX endpoint to download the metadata. That's what it just did right now. And then it's going to show me all the other endpoints that exist on that particular service for communicating with it through a non-MEX endpoint. So you see here, we have one endpoint that it found, and it exposes the eval service contract, and here are the operations that it supports. And of course, we can easily communicate with that service by simply typing in some data here and pressing invoke down here below. And if this works, we should see an empty response message, and we can go ahead and invoke get evals to see, yep, we're actually getting some evals into our system now. Okay, now how can I configure additional endpoints? Well, you do that by right-clicking on your app.config file and going to Edit WCF Configuration. And here it'll show you your service and all the endpoints that are exposed on your service along with those details. If I expand this out, I can actually drill in and I can look at the host details. Here's our base address, for example. I can also drill into the different endpoints and look at each endpoint individually through this nice UI. Okay, so let's make a few changes here. Let's come to our base address and make it something a little easier to read. Like, why don't we go and make it localhost 8080 /eval service. That's a much cleaner base address for us. And then in here, we'll go ahead and change our address for the first endpoint, the one that uses the WS HTTP binding, to be WS. Okay? And so now I have these two different endpoints, one that uses WS as the relative address and this one that uses MEX as the relative address. They both use HTTP, but they're also using different contracts. This one uses IEval service and this one uses iMetadata exchange. We're essentially seeing the same thing I just showed you in the configuration file, only now we're looking at it through this tool that hides all the angle brackets. Okay, now why don't we create another endpoint? So I'll right click and say new service endpoint. And then I can go ahead and configure all this stuff right here through the dialog if I want to. I could type in a relative address here. I'll just call it basic. And for the binding name, I'm going to choose the basic HTTP binding. That just does very simple SOAP messaging without all the advanced security, RM, and transaction protocols layered on top of it. So very simple SOAP interactions. And then down here for my contract, I'll go ahead and select my iEval service contract, that guy right there. So now I've got two endpoints that expose the same contract. The one that uses WS as the relative address and the one that uses basic as the relative address. So they're each going to have a unique address, but they expose the same contract. And they're each using different bindings. Now, if you come up here and click on your services and you actually click on create a new service endpoint from here, it'll launch this wizard. That will make it even easier for you to configure a new service endpoint. Instead of using that property grid I just showed you, you can actually walk through these different steps to configure a new endpoint. So let's do another one this way. The contract I want to use, yep, iEval service. What kind of binding do I want to use? Well, let's just go ahead and pick one. We're going to use TCP for this one instead of HTTP. Then we have to specify an address. We'll type in localhost 8888 WAC eval service. Then we'll hit next and then finish. And now we have another endpoint that uses the net TCP binding. This is the net TCP address. And the contract again is iEval service. Let's do one more that way. We'll come back up here, click create a new service endpoint. Hit next again. This time let's use name pipes. For the name pipes address, we'll just do localhost eval service. Hit finish. And now we have another one that uses the net name pipe binding. This is a useful binding for same machine communication, whereas the net TCP binding is useful for cross machine communication when you have WCF on both sides. Both net TCP and net name pipes are really only useful when you have WCF on both sides of the wire. Okay, with this stuff in place, let's go ahead and save our configuration file and close this window down. And then let's look at all the changes that it made. Notice now we have all of these different endpoints within our config file. We have a total here of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different endpoints. 2 that use HTTP, 1 that uses net TCP, and 1 that uses net pipe. Then, of course, we have our MEX endpoint for interacting with the service to find out about all the other endpoints. Okay, and notice also that our base address changed based on the address that we specified in the dialog. Now that we have all these different endpoints in place, let's go ahead and test the service with this new configuration. I'll press F5 to load the service up into our test host application. Notice our eval service has started. Notice the metadata address is now at localhost 8080 eval service MEX. Okay, and you'll notice that the test client loaded up and communicated with our service at our new MEX endpoint address, and then downloaded the information, all the metadata, about the other endpoints exposed on the service. And notice now we have 4 different endpoints that expose the iEval service contract. One of them uses the WSHTTP binding, one uses basic HTTP, one net TCP, and the last one net name pipes. Now I can simply choose which one of these endpoints I want to use to talk to my service. Let's go ahead and come in here and for comments type in basic HTTP and just some submitter name, and then we'll press invoke. And that's going to communicate with our service through that particular endpoint using all of the communication details specified by that endpoint in the metadata. Okay, then I'll come down here to the NetTCP binding and click on submit eval, and we'll type in comments of NetTCP, and then we'll type in the submitter name of Aaron again and press invoke. And that's going to do it differently using the details around the NetTCP communication options. Okay, and then finally I'll come down here and use NetName pipe binding to actually go and get the evals in the system. And we communicated with that one using NetName pipes, and notice we got 2 evals back. One that was sent in through the basic HTTP endpoint, and the other that was sent in through the NetTCP endpoint. So here we have a service that exposes multiple endpoints to the outside world, allowing a variety of different types of clients to be able to communicate with it using different wire level protocols and message formats. This ability to configure endpoints on your service after you've written the code is one of the key features offered by WCF. Thank you for watching this video in the WCF Developer Screencast series. You can find more in-depth online training videos at pluralsight.com. Pluralsight offers an extensive library of online training courses covering a variety of current and emerging Microsoft technologies, and you can access this valuable content from anywhere, anytime within just a few clicks, while still learning from industry experts you trust. Check it out today at pluralsight.com.